Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome to our Ireland chapter of PMI series of lunchtime webinars. We have Scott Carver with us today, so hopefully you can see us all on video today. We have Scott, who we'll introduce in a moment, and we also have Ian Elliott, who's our PMI ECC Liaison Officer. So he's the guy that collaborates with our European Union friends across the whole continent. So we'd like to have a panelist on with us, so if there's any questions that we are able to pick those up. Today's webinar, I think anyone who's registered will know that we are introducing the principles of crisis management. So we're very fortunate to have Scott Carver with us here. He's business continuity and crisis management consultant at Searchlight Resilience. He's going to present to us today on the different phases of crisis management and how they should be managed. So we are really looking forward to getting some of your interaction today on this webinar as well. So as usual, for those of you who've been with us with the last few webinars, you'll know that we have a poll kicked off on menti.com. So if you can grab your phone, and if you can, and I'll show you the code here now, if you can go to menti.com and use the code 562323, and you'll see the questions pop up there. And in this webinar today, we are actually quite packed with time because Scott has put a very big agenda together for us, so we're all quite excited about this. So we're going to hold the questions until the end. We're going to keep 10 minutes at the end for those questions. So, so you can also use menti.com to raise your questions. You can also, of course, pop a question into the chat here on webinar. So if you have any technical issues, I'll be able to monitor those and pick those up as well. So Scott, thank you very much for joining us, and we're delighted to have you with us today. So I'm going to hand over now to Scott, and he's going to tell you a little bit about himself, and he's going to get started. Okay. Here we go. And we'll be working on the menti.com in the background, guys.
Yeah, we'll just.
Thanks, Scott. Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There we go. Hopefully my screen will come up.
Yep, perfect, Scott.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody's well and staying safe despite these challenging times that we're all faced with at the moment. My name's Scott Carver, as Katrina kindly introduced me as before. I've been working in the resilience industry since 2006. I've actually got a financial services background, so I've come from a risk and compliance background before moving across into business continuity, into risk proper, crisis management, disaster recovery, and all the elements that make up the wider resilience topic. I work with customers, my team work with customers spanning telco, media, production, manufacturing, banking, financial services, and we do this all the time. So at the moment with COVID-19, of course, we're exceptionally busy supporting our customers in different phases of their planning and implementation, as well as supporting them managing crisis management calls that are going on all the time in the background, of course, when working out what's going to go, what needs to be delivered next as new information comes through from the respective governments. So the purpose of today really is to introduce you to the concept of crisis management and where business continuity works alongside crisis management, and hopefully there'll be some elements that you may be familiar with through your own organisation, and we can perhaps cover some of those questions off at the end as part of this webinar today. So hopefully you can all see the presentation. So let's get straight into the deck itself. Just to reiterate, the questions we are going to hold off until the end, please, purely because I've packed the presentation with lots of information. I'd like to cover you as much information as I can in approximately 50 minutes, leaving approximately 10 minutes at the end of the session to answer those questions. So if you do want to log your question through menti.com, please use the password you can see on screen there, and hopefully it's nice and clear. So the agenda today then is basically made up of the following elements. So I'm going to take you through the crisis management principles. So what's the purpose, what's the aim, what's the objective of having crisis management in place in the organisation? I'm going to take you through the phases of crisis management as well. From a planning perspective, you know, when we're actually delivering our recovery, our response activities, what are we actually aiming to deliver in those particular sections? And I want to introduce you to the relevant phases during a crisis, and I'll talk about COVID-19 and where we probably are now versus where we need to get to in order to get back to some kind of normality later. So I'll introduce us to the phases of crisis management. I'm going to talk about the communications and activity framework. Some may know it as command and control, and really what we're saying is, the people and the teams responsible for managing and coordinating the crisis management of the business, using the business continuity plans and everything else that's being developed to ensure the business survives and the business continues to operate after the event. And of course, plans themselves are really important. And talking with lots of people all the time, it's clear and apparent that in one organisation, a business continuity plan might be being developed for one purpose, and in the similar organisations being developed for a totally different purpose. So I want to talk about the variety of business continuity plans that exist in organisations, how they work harmoniously together, and as importantly, if not more importantly, how we establish the data required for those plans, i.e. what are we trying to protect? When are we trying to recover them by? What's the impact to the business if we've not recovered them in a certain time frame? So we'll talk about business impact analysis. I'm also going to introduce business continuity solutions, which for some of you may rename that as business continuity strategy. Might be more familiar to you, but business continuity solutions is really looking at how we deliver the recovery requirements from the data we've gathered in the business impact analysis. And then, as I said before, we're going to talk about the different types of plans that will then contain all that information and allow your organisation the chance to recover within the timeframes that you've stated, ensuring that your brand and reputation is maintained and protected at all times. Okay, so crisis management. So I understand from this GoToWebinar platform that you can click on a button and you can raise your hand. So please, can you just click on the button if you've had any involvement in crisis management before in your organisation currently, or another organisation previous to your current employment, because that'd be really good to understand how many people have been involved in some capacity. What I'd like to do then is bring us all together first of all, and let's look at the word crisis. Let's look at the naming conventions and make sure we're all on the same page. There are lots of naming conventions for major incidents, crises, emergencies and disasters. And what I want to try and do is bring them together as one definition to help us move forward. I'm going to give you two definitions just so you can see different examples of how crises are determined, but ultimately still mean the same thing. So we've got two definitions here. One is from the Technical Standards 17091, which is a British Standard Institute document, purely on crisis management. And the second is from the International Standard ISO 22301 for business continuity management systems. So the first example is an unprecedented or extraordinary event or situation that threatens an organisation and requires a strategic, adaptive and timely response in order to preserve its viability and integrity. And that's really important, in terms of establishing the strategic element, the adaptive element. We all automatically, as human beings, in whatever capacity we operate in our organisations, want to do something immediately. We want to start resolving a situation that's presented to us. But what we need to understand is who in the organisation is best placed to be able to do that. Who in the organisation is best placed to be able to provide the direction for us to be able to do that. So we need that strategic lead from the organisation. And of course, even with the most well-rehearsed and well laid out plans, something else could occur, such as COVID-19 unexpectedly, which may render your existing plan suite, not quite fit for purpose for whatever reason. So the plans and the systems and everything we're going to talk about today, and as demonstrated in this example, need to be adapted to the situation that presents itself, as well as how it continues to develop through that cycle until it's actually gone away and we've recovered from it. And of course, the timely response is so important. We need to recover certain parts of our organisation for our customers, and our customers could be internal to the department, in a timely manner in order for the organisation itself to survive. So again, timely response is important in order to preserve its viability and its integrity and its place in the market. So that's one example of a crisis definition. So a second example is a situation then with a high level of uncertainty that disrupts the core activities and/or credibility of an organisation and requires urgent action. And again, picking up on the example I gave you a minute ago above, the two elements there, core activities and/or credibility of an organization. So when we talk about crisis management and when we talk about business continuity planning and preparation, we're not focusing immediately on the whole of the business. COVID-19 has shown us what our business tolerances are for disruption. Some of you may have been parked temporarily to one side and some of your activities might have been downplayed or downgraded for a period of time, while other more urgent activities and support has been stepped up in other parts of the organisation. That's a perfectly natural thing to do, and that's absolutely right to do so. That doesn't mean that you're any less important, of course. It just means that the different elements of the organisation have to be put together in much the same way as a jigsaw does, in a certain way, in order for the key services and the products of the organisation to be recovered first to a certain level or to an agreed level, which may not be 100% initially, before then bringing everything else back online later on. Again, we'll talk through where we really are with COVID-19 in a few slides' time and how that really looks and how that pieces together. So the crisis management principles then. So crisis management principles are there really to give some direction and meaning and the reason for doing it. So pre-crisis, so well before a crisis has occurred, blue sky, nothing's happening, we should develop clear, effective systems, procedures, structures, roles and responsibilities. When this situation actually plays out, we should promptly understand the situation. So if a crisis has occurred in the organisation, first of all, how was it reported? How was it identified? How did we impact assess it? What parts of the organisation, what part of our customer or product or service delivery has been impacted by this situation? So we need to understand the event. Clearly, we need to establish command and control of the situation very, very quickly. We need to manage and promote situation awareness throughout the structure. So each team involved in the response and recovery effort needs to understand where we are in the recovery life cycle, what our performance for our recovery activities looks like. Has it played out as we expect it to play out? Do we need to change strategy with the way we recover our business or the impacted parts of our business? And again, I'm sure most of you have been significantly impacted by home working. The announcement of the lockdown procedure or restriction obviously has meant that we've all had to step back. We've all had to start to find our own way again, try to understand, what does work, what doesn't work for us, and pick ourselves up. But now we've got to a position in most cases where we're working in a new norm. All of you are sat at home, I imagine, watching this presentation today. Who would ever have thought 12 months ago that on a Thursday at lunchtime you'd be sat working from home if it's not part of the way you work normally, watching a webinar such as this, using the technology available to us that now is available to us in the marketplace, to be able to do that and continue to deliver the key activities that we need to ensure our business survival from. So we need to make sure that as part of the crisis, we manage and promote situational awareness throughout the structure at all times, not just from the beginning of the crisis. We need to understand, again, what do our actions that we've taken positively influence as part of this crisis? How far away are we from recovering properly? We need to obviously ensure that our communications are appropriate, and that's absolutely key. In most organizations, in most industries, in most elements in business, communication is almost the primary requirement in a crisis. What are we telling our people? What do we as staff need to understand? Where do we go for extra information? What are we telling our customers? What are we telling all our impacted other stakeholders? And again, we need to manage that, of course, and it needs to be driven by a strategy. So again, this is coming from the top of the organization, who again own the brand and reputation of the organization. So that needs to be built in to the principles of crisis management. And again, we need to ensure that the activities that we develop for managing crisis are considered, are coordinated, are target resolution activities, i.e. we know what we're trying to achieve in all phases of crisis, which I'm going to introduce you to shortly. But again, as importantly, we need to ensure we've rehearsed this so it becomes familiar and people's confidence levels are raised outside of the crisis proper. So really important that everything's driven that way and managed that way. And again, we need to maintain effective management, strategic leadership throughout the life cycle of the crisis itself. An example recently is we've been supporting one of the big universities here in the UK, and what was happening was some of the strategic managers, some of the senior executive members, including the Chancellor, were stepping down to a tactical role. We had to sort of back them back off a little bit and say, no, you're a strategic player in this crisis management process, in this crisis management framework. We need to think strategically and let the managers work out the tactical activities based on your strategy, which they'll then manage through the operational implementers. But again, I'm going to cover the framework for crisis management and give you a best practice example in a few slides' time. So can we just have a show of hands, please, using the button available to you, of who's actually involved in your crisis management framework? Are you part of the crisis management team, either now or have you been previously, please? Because it's always good to understand how many people have actually been on the front line. I know certainly Ian and I have worked together on numerous occasions, and we've managed several crises together for one of the organisations that I engage with. And so, you know, being on the front line, being able to manage and deliver crises management activities is really important. And I'd just like to understand who's actually done that, please.
Yes, so I'm just having a look here, Scott, and I've turned on the raise hands for the first time today, and people are getting the hang of it, which is fantastic. So at the moment, we've about 12 hands raised. So we've 72 people who've joined. Fantastic, guys. So we really appreciate you all joining us. And yeah, we've about 12 people that have put their hand up. So, and I popped the question as well. So either they're involved right now or they've been involved previously in crisis management. So
okay, well, that's quite a big, yeah. So thank you for that, Katrina. That's quite a big proportion actually from a program management perspective. And I'm conscious, of course, some of these people maybe not focused just on program management. It's something else they do as part of their role, but that's quite a big percentage. So hopefully some of these elements that I'm talking through today and presenting today will I suppose align with what you know crisis management to be, or maybe provide you with some information to take away back to your own respective organisations to either improve or review what you've got in place already. So thank you for that, Katrina. It's fantastic. So what I want to talk about now then are the phases of crisis management. And this is from a planning perspective, from a response perspective, and then what do we do afterwards perspective. And this is really important to put these elements together to be able to look forward, respond, adapt, and continue that life cycle forward so we are always prepared. As Ian will testify, I'm sure, you know, once a crisis is in play, my mind is always on what's the next crisis that could occur for an organisation. So how do we quickly wrap up the situation as best we can? How do we quickly recover the activities that need to be recovered to ensure the business's survival? And how do we stand down people as quickly as we possibly can to get people rested up, just in case we get the call or we identify a crisis has occurred again very shortly afterwards. So we've got to be really fluid, really efficient in doing this. And hopefully, as Ian will testify, it's very easy to stand people up in a crisis. It's very easy to make telephone calls and ask people to join you in a room or ask you to join a conference line or teleconference bridge. That's very easy to do. What's not very easy to do is actually to be able to stand people down. What's the appropriate time to stand people down? And again, for those people that have been involved, and 12 of you said you have, maybe you've got some good experience of that. But let's go through the phases of crisis.
I think, Scott, as well, just to add on that point there, Scott, as well, is when you're managing the crisis, it's what that crisis is going to lead on to next, and whether that causes a crisis or has an impact on other things that may then become a crisis is what we find a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, and actually, and thank you for that, because on the next slide, I'm going to take us through the actual 3 elements of crisis management. So whilst I'm talking holistically, I'm going to obviously bring the bullets up shortly about crisis management from a planning and delivery perspective. The next slide will talk about the phases of a crisis and how we do exactly that, Ian. So thank you for that. So let's look at the 3 phases of crisis management then from a planning perspective. So pre-crisis then, I mentioned this a few slides ago. So pre-crisis, so perfect world, business as usual, operation, it's all running smoothly. What we should be doing is forever looking forward and looking at potential issues that could impact the organization. And we use the relationship between threats and risks. So a threat example, for example, might be severe weather is forecast. What we need to understand then, of course, is what could the risks be in terms of how do those impact elements present themselves to our business and could cause us disruption. So we should be horizon scanning. We should be doing some kind of risk assessment based on that horizon scanning. You know, once we've completed the risk management and the risk elements, risk assessment elements, you know, what can we put in place to reduce the impact or reduce the longevity of the impact if anything like that does play out? And again, just please can we have a show of hands by clicking the button. I'd just like to understand who's involved or has been involved in any form of risk process around business survival. And that might be operational risk, that might be enterprise risk, it might be known as something else, but I'd just like to have a show of hands, please, in terms of who's been involved in any kind of risk framework before. And in fact, I'm just going to pause for a second. I'll just let you press the button. And then Katrina, can you just give me an idea, please, of who's been involved in the risk process before?
I'm just having a look here now, and actually there's a lot more hands popping up, which I suppose we would expect from a quorum of project managers. I'm trying to do a quick scan. Gosh, we've just three. Wow, we've more than double actually at this stage. So
Right. Okay.
I'm going to count really quickly, and this is, yeah, people are, just give it 10 more seconds, because actually the majority of people are raising their hands. I'd say actually what we have here is about 20 people who haven't raised their hands, so probably about 50 people in the audience, which would be, I suppose, understandable. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, from a project perspective, we should, of course, be looking at the impact to the organization from a risk perspective through the introduction of that new project. You know, as we're implementing that project, what are the potential impacts to the organization from a business interruption perspective? And again, I suppose once we've then implemented that project, depending on the type of project, of course, we need to look at, you know, how that impacts the wider risk framework of the organization now. You know, have we now produced or presented ourselves with new threats or a new threat landscape and the associated risks because of what we've introduced? And of course, if we've wound things back, of course, that landscape may have changed for the better, it might have gone the other way. But ultimately, crisis management is taking that information that you find typically on risk registers and looking at the information and seeing what we can do with that. Can we influence the impact on an organization if that mitigated or treated risk actually does materialize? So what we're talking about here really is a horizon scanning. We're talking about risk assessment with mitigation and management built in. And again, lots of you have lots of experience or certainly been involved in the risk process by the sound of things. Then we're looking at development then of a crisis management and business continuity framework. And what I mean by that really is effective systems. So systems such as how do we report incidents on a very basic level. We're working with an organization recently where they had 34 different ways of reporting incidents, which whilst in isolation it looked absolutely fantastic and looked really effective, when it actually came to a crisis occurring, the information was lost in translation. So we're able to aggregate that information down. And of course, if you've got lots of different ways of reporting incidents, are all staff aware of all those different ways of reporting incidents? You know, we should have a really simple way of, you know, incident reporting, incident escalation. So these are the sorts of systems I'm talking about. And when I talk about systems here, so incident reporting, impact assessment, how do we categorize the incident that's now presented itself based on the impacts? Again, these are all systems. Procedures, how do we actually do this? Do we log on via a portal to raise an incident? Do we make a phone call? Do we do it some other way? You know, structures, you know, what does the escalation process look like? Do we go straight to a team, regardless of our position in the organization, and raise this incident? Or do we go through our line management channels first, and when we get to a certain level, then we step across to a dedicated person or team that then take that forward? So again, those sorts of structures need to be thought about. Of course, once we've actually escalated to these individuals or these teams, what are they then going to do with it? You know, which teams are they potentially going to activate? And we talk about maybe gold, silver and bronze, strategic, tactical and operational teams. If we take about information security, you know, computer security incident response teams or computer security emergency response teams, both CSIRT of course. Yeah. So again, what does the escalation look like and the activation process look like to get the information to these people? How do we brief them? Of course, everybody, once they've had a briefing, needs to have a plan to follow. There should be some structure there, of course. So that's where business continuity plans come into play. You know, and a business continuity plan, of course, is only a task list, and it should be something that's already been well developed, well researched, but simple in its format. It should be easy to engage with. It should take the people or the individual through a process that's familiar to them, because they hopefully will have been involved in the creation of that plan. To arrive at a position that is acceptable to the organisation during a crisis. Preferably, we've recovered 100% of whatever was impacted and that plan was covering. But in some cases, less than 100% for a period of time is also appropriate for that organisation. And we talk about impact thresholds, and we'll cover those in a few seconds, as part of that decision process in terms of how we develop these plans. Of course, people development. Unfortunately, I come across lots of crisis management teams, lots of incident management teams, where through conversation it's clear they've never had any training. So this may, you know, ring bells in your organisation in terms of you've been given a title, such as you're part of the incident response team or part of the major incident management team or emergency management team or crisis management team, but actually that's all you have been given. Again, we need to train people in these roles. What does it mean? Again, you know, as aligned to all the other roles in an organisation, you would expect to be trained and then coached to be able to do that role. It's exactly the same for crisis management, of course. People need to understand the part they need to play as an individual in a team, but also the part the wider team needs to play when a crisis occurs. So again, we just need to sit down with people and show them where they fit in and how they perform their role and support them fully to do that. So that's the people development element. In terms of training, coaching, and of course exercising. Exercising, we might call it testing, is so important outside of a crisis, and of course this is part pre-crisis phase of crisis management. So a crisis hasn't occurred here, so we should have, or we should make the opportunity, or sorry, the time for exercising this, rehearsing these roles, rehearsing these systems, testing. If we have mass notification tools, for example, testing that they work, testing that people receive the messages and understanding the responses to them. If you have alternative sites, as I'm sure some of you do, and we'll cover some of those in a few minutes, if you have alternative sites where you might leave your primary site if it's impacted and go and work from an alternative location, other than home working, of course, you know, is that tested? Are the technology links already in place? Can we divert telephony, for example, you know, to those alternative sites? Can you simply finish what you're doing on a Thursday lunchtime in your primary environment, get in a taxi or your own transport, arrive at the secondary site and pick up and carry on from where you left off? And that's obviously a true test of a true capability. So we need to look at this, we need to exercise this. All this needs to be coached, all this needs to be agreed well before a crisis could possibly occur. And of course, COVID-19 is proving, you know, the importance of having lots of this in place. And of course, the very best organisations where they've got this in place and have rehearsed it for years and years, even so, have still had issues through COVID-19 that weren't expected. And again, the process has got to be adaptive. So if we look at crisis response then, so crisis response is crisis has now occurred. So we should have a timely invocation or an activation and implementation of the crisis management framework through to what we call stand down. And what I mean by crisis management framework are those people, those individuals, those teams that are responsible for ensuring the business survival. And as Ian will testify, I talk about putting different hats on, taking different hats off. You know, a crisis management team consists of people in the organisation. Those people in the organisation, like yourselves and those of you who are involved in this, will testify, have your business as usual roles to deliver, that you are being performance managed on to a degree. And you may have KPIs, you know, that you've got to achieve, of course, as part of your annual appraisal. Okay, so what we're saying is when a crisis occurs, you need to stop doing what you're doing for the business as usual operation, take that hat off and put a totally different hat on to perform a response activity or series of activities with your colleagues as part of the crisis management team to ensure the business survives from this event. So crisis response is that timely invocation and effective implementation of that crisis management framework, including the activation and the availability and the referencing and using of all the business continuity plans. Stand down, before I leave this bullet, of course, sorry, I've just stepped over, but stand down is the target that we've agreed we need to aim to achieve. And that could be 100% of recovery from the crisis, but at the same time, it could also be perhaps 80% of recovery from the crisis, assuming that's acceptable to the organisation. Again, the stand down or the recovery target is strategically decided and strategically driven. So once we've recovered from the crisis itself, we then need to think about post-crisis phase. So we need to capture the information while it's still effective and alive in people's minds, and once the adrenaline has calmed down a little bit. So we need to do some kind of debrief, and we may do more than one type of debrief. Typically in a crisis, of course, everybody's been working long hours at a heightened sense of energy, and people generally are tired at the end of a crisis. It's a great time just to get some immediate feedback from those people before they do step down and go and get some rest. Some very high level elements of feedback in terms of what went well, what could have gone better. Yeah, just at a very high level, just before people start to, disseminate and go back to either their normal working environment or go back to bed potentially. So we need to do some kind of debrief. That's an immediate debrief, of course, and then we should have some kind of more formalised, structured debrief later on, which may include workshops, it may include calls or conferences, again, teleconference activities, just in a more structured way. And again, the purpose of debrief is to learn from the event. What did we understand? How did we perform as a collective and at team level? Were our plans appropriate? Having a conversation, for example, the other day, I was talking to somebody who has a plan in their organisation that talks about working from an alternative location, and they do have a secondary standby site. Now, that was the only business continuity plan that existed in the organisation, which is fantastic to have that, of course, but actually, how does that help if technology has fallen over, for example? How does that help if we have a major people incident? And I'm putting COVID-19 to one side when I'm saying this, but such as gastroenteritis or something else, something much shorter in terms of impact to the organisation. But we need to think about all the different types of scenario. And again, going back to pre-crisis, the first bullet on the slide, what are the types of impact that could play out to our organisation and the threats behind them that cause those impacts? And do we have appropriate plans in place? So again, post-crisis gives us an opportunity straight after the event, preferably as soon after the event as possible, to have a structured debrief where we look at the systems, we look at the procedures, we look at, have we got the right people in these teams? Are the people supported? Have we trained them? Have they been coached? Have we now got new training requirements, that have obviously been highlighted because of this crisis? And of course, what we need to think about then is how we continue to move this forward. And post-crisis, of course, then automatically feeds back round to pre-crisis. It goes back into the planning circle. So I'm going to focus now on crisis response. So in a crisis itself has three phases, and we call them response, recovery, which is often known as continuity, and that's where business continuity comes from as a naming convention. And we have resumption, which could also be known as restoration in your organisation. So the response phase in a crisis is understanding at the very outset that we have an issue. Are we able to acknowledge all incident types? And incident types, of course, take many forms. Technology incidents, so IT information, communications, so applications, could be something to do with data. Of course, we've got cybercrime, we've got information security incidents occurring. But ultimately, that's one incident type under technology. We've got people incidents, which I've just briefly touched on the last slide. We've got supply chain incidents. We might have just reputation only incidents, i.e. the operation of the organisation hasn't been impacted, but the reputation might be being impacted negatively. You know, and we could have all sorts of other incident types, such as facilities. You know, our estate or part of our building infrastructure might have been damaged, and that might just be compromised because of local conditions such as a flood. We may have utilities issues, you know, for the electricity, the gas, the water that are causing issues that render that site unavailable for a period of time. And of course, all this is in a totally unplanned capacity. So as part of response, we need to understand all the different incident types that we need to consider as part of our planning process, as part of our crisis management and business continuity framework. So we need to understand how to acknowledge all incident types. We need to be able to impact assess them. And impact categories could be, what's the impact strategically to our organisation because these products and services are now being suspended or degraded? What's the impact to our organisation financially? What's the impact to our organisation from a reputation perspective? And the fourth example I'll give before I move on is, what's the impact to our organisation operationally because of the situation that's now presented itself? And of course, an operational impact means that people have got to do different things. And I gave the example a few minutes ago of people taking one hat off and putting another hat on. Well, those activities that have been parked because people have put their crisis management hat on need to be picked back up later on, of course. So we need to understand the impact of parking those activities for that period of time. So impact assessment is really important. You know, if an event occurs, you know, what's the impact of the organisation against categories such as those I've just given examples of. We need to then categorise the incident based on the impacts. Some of you may use what we call ticketing systems, so priority 1, priority 2, priority 3 events. So that's where those sorts of systems come to the fore. So we need to have some kind of way of evaluating those impacts and categorising the significance of that impact, which then of course will provide the direction for how we're going to manage it forward. So if we get to a certain level of impact and we've reached certain thresholds that are pre-established in the pre-crisis phase, so as part of our planning outside of a real event, we should then be able to escalate really efficiently, really quickly to our crisis management team. So we need to be able to escalate quickly to them, which means we need to activate the crisis management team. So again, as part of our pre-crisis phase, we need to think about how we're going to contact people quickly. You know, if it's 2:30 on a Sunday morning, you know, how are we going to raise people from their beds? How are we going to ensure we give them enough time to get themselves prepared to join the call? You know, are we relying on generally just making phone calls to people? Are we using mass notification tools? Are we using other methodologies? So again, we need to think about that activation process. And again, much in the same way as a 100-meter race uses a start pistol. You know, when a crisis presents itself, effectively a starting pistol has gone off. So we need to make sure that the crisis management team are able to get out of those blocks, those racing blocks, really quickly and running down the track as fast as they can. Again, we just need to mobilize that response, that unit, as soon as possible. So that activation process is important. So again, going through the response phase here, what have we got in place? What have we put in place? What have we rehearsed previously in the pre-crisis phase to ensure that our response element to the crisis is appropriate and effective? And of course, to support the crisis management teams, we need to then brief the crisis management teams and provide them with the information about the impacts that's known at that time. You know, on the back of that information, we already should have scripted go to and deliver this scripts as part of our business continuity plans. And of course, around all of that, going back to what I said earlier, we need to make sure we communicate effectively and promptly and appropriately. So who are the audience stakeholders that we need to engage with first and why? And again, we should have established all this as part of the pre-crisis phase. And then once we get to the response element in a crisis, it's just a case of implementing what we've already agreed using primary and/or secondary methods of communication. So the second phase, is once we've agreed what those initial communications and those initial recovery activities need to be, we then just need to deliver them. And the recovery or the continuity phase is essentially ensuring the business survives. Recovery or continuity is focused on the core activities that feed the priority products and services of an organization. So when we talk about continuity or business continuity, what we're effectively saying is, out of everything that's delivered by an organization, from a product or service perspective, we've already identified in the pre-crisis phase what's really important and what needs to be protected and recovered first when a crisis does actually occur. So during the actual response phase, during the phases of crisis management, in the response phase, we've just reconfirmed those activities. We've reconfirmed the products and services we need to recover first. In the response phase, in the recovery phase, we're now going to implement the required activities to ensure that we recover those prioritized activities which feed those products and services. And let's get those back up and running as soon as possible. So of course, the recovery phase is the recovery of those prioritized products and services and the activities and all the dependencies that underpin them. But it also is around the communications piece as well, getting those initial communications out and managing the performance of those communications and really trying to hold back communications audiences as much as possible with information we're pushing out proactively. Of course, being careful of what we're saying and how we're saying it. So that's recovery and continuity. So once we've got to the recovery phase or the end of the recovery phase, what we're actually saying is we've shored up the business's survival. We've still got lots of activities, lots of products and services, or maybe some elements of the key products and services that haven't been recovered yet, but at least we've shored up the survival of the organization. So the third phase, and this goes back to something Ian said a few minutes ago, is arguably as important. It's the resumption phase. So the resumption phase, or in other words, restoration phase, is how we then take the business from that recovery position all the way back to business as usual. As part of the recovery phase, we may have introduced secondary resources. We may have moved people. And in fact, let's talk about COVID-19. We are actually in a recovery phase of sorts. Your organization, yourselves as individuals, are working to a new norm. We've all been through some pain. We've all been through some disruption, and I'm sure we've all probably got some issues that we still need to resolve and work through, such as, who's fighting over the iPad, which room can I hold a conference call from if you don't have an office, and does the technology work as you'd like it to do, including your broadband connection. But ultimately, we're still working through that. But essentially, if you are working in your organization, then your organization is very much still alive and you've actually found a new norm. So we've actually got to the point of a plateau at this point in COVID-19. We've still got another, almost a vertical to get through in order to get back to business as usual later. And there are probably still some elements of COVID-19 that could occur, and some of the restrictions may well change, may become even firmer for a period of time, depending on how obviously the disease plays out. But ultimately, at some point, we have got to get back to some kind of new working normal. And again, if we don't manage that element of the crisis management phase appropriately, we could actually cause ourselves more issues, as Ian referred to earlier. That in itself could cause another crisis if we don't manage that properly. If we don't step away from our secondary resource options, for example, in a phased way, and ensuring that we're continuing the delivery of our products and services to the level we've got them to in recovery, we could actually plunge them back into a crisis. We could actually degrade the services again and suspend them again for a period until we get back to our primary working environment, for example. So we need to be careful. Okay. So communications and activity framework. So I think 12 of you talked about your involvement in the crisis management team, which is fantastic. So this piece now is really looking at that crisis management framework. So one of the best practice crisis management frameworks for establishing business continuity, for establishing command and control, is known as the gold, silver and bronze framework. In fact, can I just have a show of hands, please, clicking the button, how many people have heard of gold, silver and bronze, or as it's also named, strategic, tactical and operational, please? And Katrina, can you just let me know the numbers in a minute, please?
I'm just having a look here now. So, well, so far we've 13 hands raised.
Okay.
I haven't heard of it, I have to say. Ian raised his hand as well there virtually.
Yep.
You can see him in the video.
I would expect Ian to.
Yeah. So we have, yeah, there's 13 people who've heard of it.
Okay.
So,
Okay. So
yeah.
13 people have heard of it and may be involved in part of your crisis management within your organisation as well. So what I'm going to take you through is a framework that was established in the 40s, in 1944. It was in the military, and it was a way of managing activities in a war environment, strangely enough. Not that I want to be talking too much about wars, of course. We've got a war going on, of course, with COVID-19 at the moment. But ultimately, this is a proven methodology for managing the different roles and responsibilities when crises occur. And it's known as gold, silver, and bronze, but it's also known as strategic, tactical, and operational. So that's what I'm going to take us through now as an example of a command and control structure or communications and activity framework that works really well when it's implemented and rehearsed and I suppose embedded in an organisation. And Ian, I know obviously Ian's been introduced at the start of this session, and I keep referring to him. Ian is part of one of my customers' gold, silver, and bronze structures. So this will be familiar to Ian I hope. So
Too
let's
familiar.
think about too familiar. Yes, I know Ian.
Unfortunately.
Yes. So strategic. Okay. So strategic. People in the organisation outside of a crisis are strategic players, of course. You know, your executive team, your senior management teams provide and deliver and have the responsibility for strategic delivery, for strategic decisions in an organisation. That doesn't change when we get to a crisis. We need that strategic direction. We need that authority. We need that approval sign-off. So the strategic team are the hands-off thinkers. And what I mean by hands-off is they are not involved in the actual delivery of the recovery itself. They haven't got the sleeves rolled up. They haven't got the buckets of water over the flames. They're not dealing with walking wounded and casualties. They're actually remote from the organisation, thinking strategically, thinking about how we get ahead. So if we look at this, they're typically the executive level, because again, for a strategic role in a crisis, we need to have people that already perform a strategic role and are competent in it in the business as usual environment. We should have, they again are the people that will formulate or sign off the recovery strategies. So, you know, what are we recovering first, for example? To what level? Does it need to be 100%? Which customers are we going to recover our services for first, for example, and which ones are we going to suspend for a period of time? Again, that's a strategic decision. Of course, protection of life is so important, and that's number one when we're talking about crises. That's the number one strategic target and responsibility for the emergency services, of course, is protection of life. So of course, that hasn't changed just because we've got crisis management in an organisation. So protection of life, business second, is the order of events. So again, from a strategic perspective, we need to ensure the business survives. So we need to ensure that the reputation of the organisation is protected and enhanced where possible. If we can find some ways of enhancing our reputation in a situation because the way we're managing a situation, then that's again a very positive step to take. But again, that's owned by the strategic team. They're responsible for the brand, the reputation of the organisation, which of course then is managed and implemented through effective communications and appropriate communications. So the strategic team are also responsible not just for the recovery direction based on the crisis as we know it now and the impacts that we're currently being faced with, but they're also thinking about how do we get ahead. COVID-19 has given us a fantastic platform from that. In terms of, we know where we are at the moment with COVID-19, we believe, from the information provided to us, but what else might come through? What else can we do to try and get ahead of this? People are talking about easing restrictions, for example. Well, if we're talking about easing restrictions in due course, then what does that look like? How do we get ahead to ensure that we've got a smooth transition from the recovery phase I talked about before through to resumption, if these restriction levels are eased and eventually do get put to one side. So again, we're thinking about how we get ahead of this situation and also preparing for further issues. So again, the strategic team should almost be sat back with the feet on the table, for example, and thinking about other situations that might present themselves, including the risks associated with our current delivery strategy in this crisis situation. Is our current delivery strategy appropriate? Are we directing the teams on the ground who are responsible for the recovery implementation itself the right way? Or are we causing ourselves further problems later on? So again, from a strategic perspective, we're thinking about how we can get ahead and how we prepare for further issues. From a strategic perspective, we need somebody to manage the situation for us. So they will support and regularly engage with the tactical teams, which I'm going to come on to in a second. So again, the direction comes from the strategic teams, the management of the situation, and the resource coordination comes from the tactical teams, which of course needs to be supported by the strategic teams. And again, in order for that to occur, there needs to be regular, frequent engagement. So let's talk about the tactical teams. Sorry, before I step forward, the strategic teams is also known as the gold team. So let's talk about the tactical team now, or the silver team. Oh, sorry. So the tactical teams are the hands-on planners. So they are more engaged now, not the hands-off thinkers as the strategic teams were. And the hands-on planners are typically senior managers that report into those senior teams or heads of department level membership. Okay. They take the direction from the strategic team and challenge fairly if they don't believe the direction is appropriate based on the information being received from the ground. But again, fair challenge is appropriate. They deliver the recovery strategy through the operational teams. So the strategic team come up with the recovery strategy or sign off against the recovery strategy, but it's the tactical team or the silver team that are responsible for the delivery of the recovery through the operational teams on the ground. Again, protection of life, that theme carries forward. We're not expecting that to disappear. And then we need to think about the delivery of internal and external communications, of course. The silver team or the tactical team are responsible for the delivery of those communications, and they provide the management, guidance and support to the operational teams, using and following the business continuity plans where they exist. So the tactical team are also responsible for the recovery resources, provision and coordination. And they're also there to make sure that any conflicts are resolved between resources. So if we need one person to do one activity as part of our recovery, but we also need that one person to do something else over there, they're responsible for managing and coordinating the resources required for recovery. And of course, from their perspective, they need to understand what's going on at the coalface from ground level all the time. So they're regularly engaging with the operational teams on the ground who are delivering the recovery, of course. So the last team is the operational team or the bronze team, and these are the hands-in, these are the people doing it. So these are the people effectively recovering your organization. They're typically operational managers or frontline resources, and that's typically the people that will be engaged at this level. And again, these people, consider them as your subject matter experts. These are the people that know how the activities glue together, that know how the processes need to be delivered, that know what makes up the fabric of the continuity of the products and services. So these are the people best placed to be able to support the recovery effort in your organization. So they receive the direction from the tactical team. And like I said before regarding fair challenge, if they feel the direction from the tactical team isn't appropriate based on the information that they know is true on the ground, they can challenge that fairly back as well. And again, they actually conduct the activities for recovery. So they implement the business continuity plan. So they not only follow them, but they actually do deliver all the activities that are in those task lists within those plans. And again, the protection of life element hasn't gone away. That carries all the way through to them. They need to at all times protect their own life and those of the colleagues and everybody else that's impacted by the event. And again, going back to the tactical team needs regular updates of what's going on with the recovery. So the operational team, the bronze team, will provide those updates to the tactical team. Okay. So for the last section, and I'm conscious of the time, everybody.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you'll have time to take questions. That's the only thing. So, but business continuity is probably a piece that people are excited to see about as well. But yeah,
okay.
Carry on. Go ahead.
Okay.
We've got a couple of questions which we'll see if we've got time for after this.
Okay. Well, I can take questions later anyway as well, so that's absolutely fine. So business continuity then. So we've talked about the crisis management process. We've talked about the teams, the roles and responsibilities in those teams. What they need, of course, are plans to assist them in that recovery and then resumption efforts. So the data required to create business continuity plans is derived from what we call business impact analysis. And that's required to establish the criticality of the products and services delivered by the organisation. So out of everything that's delivered by the organisations, which ones are most important? You know, how long can you survive for as an organisation? For example, if you took away one product and service in an unplanned capacity for a period of time versus doing the same activity with another. So again, business impact analysis is taking that feed, and it also provides that information to top management in terms of which products and services are most critical. Again, it is impact driven as well. So based on the impact scores, and that's for another workshop, of course, in terms of how we calculate the impacts, that will also help derive which products and services are most important and which are most critical. The impact analysis information also provides direction for risk assessment and risk mitigation actions. So again, it highlights, you know, and maps how each products and services and organisation is delivered, and therefore the risks that are present in that part of the organisation that could prevent the delivery of that. So again, it helps feed that process, and it prioritises the recovery order of those products and services. So again, once we've established the criticality, we're then going to put some time frames against those products and services that we need to recover them by to ensure that the survival of the organisation. So it prioritises the order of those critical products and services accordingly. Which do we need to recover first? Ultimately, we need to understand, as part of our business continuity planning for crisis management purposes, what resources we need on the ground to recover from the crisis. The business impact analysis provides us with the resources required, such as people resources from a knowledge perspective and a skills perspective, such as what technology do they need, which applications, what data, what estate dependencies do they have, so which site do they need to work from, if at all, what suppliers are involved in the delivery of these products and services, and what do those engagements look like, etc., etc. So it helps us map the resources required to deliver or recreate or recover those products and services when they're impacted through a crisis. And again, moving forward, it also then helps us to identify appropriate business continuity solutions to support the recovery of them, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And it also helps to determine the number and type of business continuity plans required to provide that recovery performance when crises occur. So let's just talk quickly about business continuity solutions. So business continuity solutions are the methodologies required to recover the prioritized services or products within the timeframes required. So examples, as we're all currently probably delivering, is home working. So this is a business continuity solution. It's a forced solution for some organizations because it may not have been planned for in this way, but ultimately home working is one solution. Alternate site working is another solution. So if you have a backup site as part of your business continuity planning, that's another solution. You might have alternative supplier arrangements. So if one supplier is impacted by a crisis, you then flick over to another and the relationship and the products and service delivery is already in place. So it's a seamless transition. You may use internal displacement. And these are just examples, of course. An internal displacement is asking people to move from one bank of desks in your organisation to make way for maybe more urgent, more critical people during a crisis. So that's internal displacement. And then, of course, standby people resources. So if you have a large-scale people impact, you might have alternative arrangements with some resource companies, some resource organisations, some recruitment companies that can provide additional standby resource in the event of people being an issue. And again, just to finalise the examples here, we might have reciprocal manufacturing arrangements, for example. So if your production line is impacted by a crisis, you might have a reciprocal manufacturing arrangement with maybe a competitor that will help assist. So you can recover your products and service deliveries using them as your business continuity solution. So plans themselves then. So the business continuity plans themselves come in all shapes and sizes. Ultimately, they provide the detailed procedures to recover the impacted products and services from an activity perspective. They provide the detailed procedures to activate and manage the business continuity solutions. So if you've decided upon an alternate site as a solution, then we should have a business continuity plan that helps you activate that alternative site, helps you mobilize the teams required to get to the alternative site to then recover those products and services. And it provides the crisis management teams with the activities required to manage the crisis through the 3 phases of response, recovery and resumption that I've talked through before. And it provides the detailed procedures to recover those impacted resource types. So if people are impacted, how do we recover the people element? If technology is impacted, how do we recover the technology? And you might call them IT disaster recovery plans, for example. That's still a business continuity plan to recover the impacted resource, which is technology. So the summary then is, with an effective, trained and rehearsed crisis management structure that is supported by appropriate tested business continuity solutions and all supporting business continuity plans, lives, the business operation, the reputation and the brand of the organisation will be best protected at all times. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Have we got time for some questions, Katrina?
Yeah, let me move them across. If people can stay with us, then they should hopefully stay with us. So I'm just going to quickly switch screens. So people have been logging on and putting their questions into menti.com, which is great. And we have a small selection of questions, not a crazy amount. I will share them here so people will be able to see them on my screen, essentially, and then you can let me know if you can see that there.
Yeah, that's perfect, Katrina.
Yep. So we've had 14, and I would say they're quite substantial questions. If you can see those, Scott, you can quite literally pick what you would like to answer.
Yeah, okay. So should we take the top left one then, since we've got lots of program management people on the Program Management Institute webinar here? Do you see
Very
typical program managers or PMOs involved in crisis management or business continuity, and if so, in what roles? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Typically in the tactical roles, at the silver team level, using the gold, silver and bronze or strategic, tactical and operational levels I talked about, purely to provide some direction and some steer. Of course, as program management specialists, you're used to looking at resources, used to looking at the threats and risks of projects, and so you are very level-headed generally, very calm under pressure, and so you add a degree of, I suppose, sanity in some cases and direction to what actually can be quite an emotional environment. So yes, absolutely. Let's have a look. I'll take the middle one there. In your experience, do you see companies with separate teams or departments for crisis management? I see both. Separate teams and departments for crisis management. Again, it depends what we're trying to protect. We talk about scope of the program, of the framework, you know, which products and services, for example, as I've been talking about through the slides. So depending on the products and services will determine then which people, which subject matter experts, their managers and the strategic directional people we need to engage. So you can have very local crisis management teams, as well as obviously the much wider crisis management team for the whole of the organisation. And for the multinationals, of course, you can have local crisis management teams across the 3 levels, as well as the 3 levels at a multinational level that they also feed into. So yeah, just looking at the COVID-19 question there, in this COVID-19 situation, I wonder, will the National Broadband Project take on new emphasis? I should imagine it will, absolutely. You know, this is very much part of the strategic thinking, I guess, of the government. It's clear that our dependencies on technology have now increased significantly from where they were before. And in fact, for crisis management development, it's a lessons learned as well, because some of these new technologies can now be introduced into the crisis management procedures and systems, of course. Let's have a look. I'll take the, what do you do if you have not got the skills in the organisation to run crisis management? Well, first of all, we need to identify, you know, what's in place for crisis management. If we've not got the skills in place, we need to do an education piece. As Ian will testify, any work that I do is generally preceded by an introduction to what crisis management and business continuity is, you know, in a very simple way, as a way of opening doors and encouraging engagement, and then taking it forward and developing a process and procedure framework based on that organisation structure and requirements.
I think, Scott, just to add in there, the important part of that is the continuous learning as well. So, you know, the refresh, all that, because typically you don't operate in crisis management mode every day. It's abnormal to be doing that. So, you know, you have to refresh your training because you never know when it's going to kick in.
Absolutely. The refresher training, of course, is really important, and I suggest quarterly where you can do, but also running an annual exercise, you know, a simulated exercise of one of the types of threats and risks that you've identified as part of your horizon scanning, as part of your pre-crisis activity. Have we got time for one more, Katrina, do we think?
Go for it.
Yeah. What about the motivation of team members during crisis management? Really important motivation. People welfare, people's mental health and state of mind, really important, often undervalued, often understated, often forgotten. And again, we just need to ensure that people feel supported for all of that through the phases of crisis management. When we're delivering crisis management training, when I'm training crisis management teams, I talk about anxiety levels going up and competency going down for a period of time when you're called upon as part of the crisis management team. So if it was 2:30 on a Sunday morning, and I use that time frame a lot, you know, we need to come out of our deep sleep, for those that have gone to sleep at that time, of course, and gather our thoughts and understand that we've got to perform. So we're hard on performance on ourselves anyway, we all know that, okay, but we've got to perform well in front of our peers as well, which we're also conscious of. And ultimately, we need to make sure we add value. So there's lots of responsibility, lots to consider. So people's emotional state and even the shape of the plans and the way the plans are written needs to be considered at all times. Keep it simple, stupid. You know, I could spend forever and a day talking about how to over-engineer crisis management and business continuity plans. And actually, as Ian will testify, I talk about it not being rocket science at all. A business continuity plan, for example, is just a task list with a series of tasks that need to be done sequentially, with some maybe in parallel, supported by supporting information to enable those tasks to be delivered only. It shouldn't be anything beyond that. You may have multiple plans that need to be managed and activated and coordinated, but again, that's the role of the crisis management team, of course, and that crisis management team needs to feel that they're involved in the process. So get these people involved in the development, the rehearsal, the training, and the exercise, and the development of plans and the processes and systems. Yeah. Have we got time for any more, Katrina, do you think? Katrina?
I think you're on mute there, Katrina.
That's like my biggest test in this webinar. Yes, I think we'll wrap it up there if that's okay. So we actually still have quite a lot of people still with us, but we are having some drop off now because it is the hour. But I have a feeling that there could be a lot more questions and we could talk about this for a lot longer. So I will just give me a second to figure out my technology as well. So we'll wrap it up there, Scott. So thank you very much. And you can see from the questions that we received and from people raising hands during the audience that it's not just that it's very topical, but I think as people who probably, like our audience is going to be project managers, program managers, portfolio managers, that we often have a part to play in the business continuity and in the crisis management. So this is very topical for us and not just because of our current time. So we really appreciate that you did the session for us today. So thank you very much. To everyone that's still with us, thanks, Scott. And we still actually have quite a lot of people with us. So we usually wrap up just by saying if you attended and you registered with your PMI number, we'll take care of your recording of your PDU. So we make it easy for you. And don't worry if you didn't, you can either drop me an email afterwards and you can always log it yourself. It's a 2-click process. So and then more importantly, remember, because we're not able to do any live events at the moment, we still have a 1-a-week webinar coming up actually all the way through until the end of June. So there's about 6 of them there at the moment that you can register for, and there'll be a couple of more coming online in a couple of weeks time. So thank you all again for joining us. Your attendance makes these webinars successful, and so does your feedback. So keep coming with the feedback, and hopefully I'll get better at using the GoToWebinar tools as well. Ian, thank you very much for being a panelist with us. So it is I think it's good, well, we can't be live, that we can show a little bit of interaction with our presenter as well. So Scott, hopefully we'll get you again.
And thanks to Scott, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
No, thank you everybody. There was a lot to try and get across in the time frame we've had. And I'd just like to say, if I can, Katrina, for those people, I see there's still 65 people on. If you've got questions that I've not answered, my contact details are on the last slide. Please get in touch and I'm happy to answer them offline accordingly.
That's a great point, guys. And as usual, we will share the slide pack up on the PMI Ireland website later, so you will be able to get access to that. And I do think that's great. I think this is very topical, so do get in touch with Scott, because there's a lot of services that can be provided there. All right, guys, thank you very much, and we'll sign off, and we'll talk again next week. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye-bye.